really fascinating and interesting interview that Richard Wolff gives with Dr. Shomar, Kristen R. Ghodsee. So, and then she has a book coming out, or that has came out um, most recently, Second World, Second Sex, Socialist Women's Activism and Global Solidarity During the Cold War, and Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And then so this is kind of what they're talking about. Why are women happier? Why do they have better sex lives under a socialist or communist government than they would under capitalism? So let's take a listen. It's pretty very interesting, I think, and definitely the full interview starts off at about the 15-minute mark, but we're just going to watch the end of it here, or listen. I should listen and watch.
That's there, and of course it's self-reported, and there are all sorts of issues with self-reported data. But given that you're asking the same questions to both sets of people before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, what we see is that women in the eastern part of Germany, the former GDR, report much higher levels of personal satisfaction with their relationships, both on a sort of emotional level as well as on an intimate level. Furthermore, we also find that men and women in Eastern Germany were more likely to want to get married than in Western Germany, where men were far less likely to want to get married than women. There was a big discrepancy between the desirability of marriage as an institution,
That's
partially
interesting.
because for women, marriage is an economic relationship, and for men, because they realize that it's an economic relationship, that women are going to need to be supported in some ways, especially if they have children. There's a discrepancy between the desirability.
Oh, yeah,
But
because it makes a lot more sense. You're going to be able to have a lot higher quality of life for you and your children if you live in a society that is actually concerned with the well-being of people. They put that before profit, so it makes complete sense when you just think about it. At least to
not
me.
just in the intimate sphere. I talk about citizenship, I talk about women's political participation, I talk about women's education and training. So, for instance, we can look at a study that was done in 2018 comparing the gender gap. There's a standardized test that is given across Europe in mathematics. For
Hmm.
instance, the name of the study is called Girls, Math, and
Yeah, this is
Sociology.
very interesting. There's less of a gender gap between the sexes in socialist or communist leaning countries than capitalist ones. What do you know?
I believe. And there's a standardized test that is given to all children across the EU. And as you know, many of the new EU member states are former socialist countries. And what we see very clearly through this study is that the gender gap between men and boys and girls in mathematics is much smaller in
Hmm.
former socialist countries than it is in capitalist countries.
Interesting.
And that persists to this day.
Wow.
In some of these socialist countries, there's no gender gap at
Look
all
at that.
in mathematics. We can also look at the percentages of women in science, technology, and engineering. At a much earlier period of time in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Bloc, women were integrated into fields that are still heavily masculinized in
Yep.
the United States and in Western Europe. So the figures are really striking. In 2019, the percentage of graduates in science, technology, math, and engineering in Germany, even the reunified one,
Yeah.
is only 28%, compared to a place like Poland where it's 43%, or Romania where it's 41%. So there are these
Again,
huge
Poland and Romania used to be more socialist or communist leaning, obviously.
payoffs. And that's just in the professional field. When we look at the intimate field, again, socialist countries very early on in the Soviet Union, under somebody like Alexander Kollontai, they tried to socialize domestic work. So there were
That's awesome.
kindergartens and creches and children's homes and public cafeterias and public laundries and mending
Look at that.
cooperatives. Now, the
Like
early
public laundries and just like actually taking care of the needs of the people, both women and otherwise. Wouldn't that be amazing to live in a society, in a world like that, that actually put the material needs of people before profits? That's all that socialism and communism is about.
Soviet Union was not able to maintain its commitments to those programs. And so for a variety of reasons, they were largely reversed or disappeared briefly after 1936 with the Third Family Code, Soviet Family Code. But in Eastern Europe after 1945, because of
Labor
labor
shortage.
shortages due to the war, many of these policies were reinstated. And so if you look across the Eastern Bloc, and there was a lot of variety, I'm not saying that it was uniform, but there was a lot of variety, but pretty much without exception, they all had very strong commitments to the socialization of childcare and housework
I
as
like
much as
that. The
possible.
socialization of childcare and housework as much as possible. And again, that obviously shouldn't be something that is divided along sex or gender lines. It's something that, each parent should be able to each household should be able to decide for themselves what that looks like. And in a socialist or communist society or country, it's obviously going to be much more equitable because, again, socialism is concerned with improving the well-being of everybody in that society, whereas a capitalist system, oftentimes the only thing that really matters is increasing profits.
And again, there's a lot of variety here. And so excluding the Soviet Union between 36 and 55 and Romania after 66 and Albania, almost all of the other countries had very, very good commitment to women's reproductive rights as well, much earlier than in the West. And then that's on top of being mobilized into the labor force and employment opportunities and what ultimately is economic independence. And that's the key sort of linchpin, I think, to women's
Economic
greater
independence.
participation in the economy, greater participation in the polity. Now, that's not whitewashing the fact that in many respects, again, lots of variety in the bloc, these were somewhat oppressive societies and some much more oppressive than others, especially in the 30s and 40s under Stalin and the Soviet Union. But I think it's really important, as you said, to deal with the Cold War that's in our minds.
Yeah.
And women's rights are one of the things that these Eastern Bloc countries did really well. In Germany today, they've just celebrated the 30th anniversary of reunification. Even in Germany, where they still consider the GDR to be a quote unquote totalitarian state, one of the two totalitarianisms that affected Germany, even West Germans are willing to accept that, okay, on this one little thing, women's rights, at least there, the East Germans got it right, and we haven't done as well. And I think it's also important to realize that these Eastern Bloc countries took their package of reforms, kindergartens, creches, support for women's employment, supports for women education and training. They took that package and they exported it anywhere in the what we call the global south, where people also were experimenting with socialist ideas. So this had a huge
That's
impact
interesting.
on the development of women's rights and women's issues and women's questions across the globe throughout the Cold War. And if anything, I would say that after 89 and 91, we have pretty good evidence to show that women's rights have actually
Gotten
started
worse.
to, lose the support of
Yeah.
the global community because the Cold War. So
Goddamn
as with so many
capitalism.
other things, having a clear ideological enemy sort of forced Western governments to really deal with some of the social issues that they would rather just sweep under the rug. And women's issues was certainly one of the most important. So I can give you lots of examples of these different kinds of very specific policies, but I think that's the general idea.
No, you have it. That's excellent. It's exactly what I was hoping to elicit from your research. I wish we had more time. We don't. Let me end with a very brief question because we have very little time. Do you think what your work is part of a rediscovery that may change things again?
Absolutely. I think that, one of the biggest problems with discussions of socialism in the West is that the Soviet experience
No,
or
the
the Eastern Bloc
Soviets.
experience is used as a cudgel to silence discussion of
That's very
socialism
true.
as a real political alternative. And I think one of the things that my work does, and I hope it contributes to larger debates and inspires other scholars who come after me, is to look back at some of these Eastern Bloc countries and say it wasn't all bad.
Yes.
There were some good things. And because of that, we can learn from those things, get rid of the bad parts, parts, salvage the good parts, and move forward into a more just, equitable, and sustainable future.
Boom. There you have it. Kristen Ghodsee. I believe, where does she teach at? It says down. Fuck off. There we go. Professor of Russian and Eastern European Studies and a member of the graduate group in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. So pretty interesting, but again, nothing that is surprising, and I'd be interesting to hear from y'all watching or listening to this. Is that surprising to you that the research and scholarship that Kristen Ghodsee has done at the University of Penn has shown that women have better sex in these socialist countries, along with all of these other really more positive outcomes, such as a more balanced distribution of childcare and housework. They're more likely to have their reproductive rights protected. They are higher representation in those STEM fields. We have, lower rates of, because she was talking about also, I think, right, the achievement gap rates are lower in those socialist countries than they are in capitalist ones. Just so many benefits happen to people, women in particular, when you organize a society around, making the highest quality of life possible for the citizenship, as opposed to a capitalist system like we have in the U.S., which, again, the prime or driving motive is just to simply increase profits, everything else be damned. So again, not super surprising from this, but still very interesting to see. Leave your comments down below. Like the video if you like the damn video. Subscribe if you aren't already. Peace, much love, all power to the people.